She tells you her past. Not the sanitized version she gave you at the beginning, but the raw, unfiltered truth that slips out months later, maybe years later, or perhaps it comes through whispers you overhear from others. And suddenly, you feel it. A sharp, nauseating drop in your stomach, like you've been punched from the inside out. Your chest tightens, your vision narrows, and your mind races with images you don't want to see but cannot stop replaying. Every detail feels like an insult carved into your skin. The laughter she once shared with another man. The intimacy she once gave so freely. The things you thought were unique between you and her suddenly feel cheap, recycled, desecrated. That gut punch is one of the cruelest shocks a man can endure, because it attacks not just your pride, but your very sense of reality. And here is the truth. It is inescapable. At some point in life, every man who opens his heart will face this revelation. The question is not whether it will happen. The question is, will it destroy you, or will it make you sovereign? This is where the Machiavellian law enters. Niccolò Machiavelli, the cold architect of power, warned us centuries ago that men who cling to illusions are devoured by them. The world is not gentle, nor is it just. The world does not bend to your hopes of purity. The world strips away the mask and shows you its teeth. What you are feeling in that gut punch is not merely betrayal or insecurity. It is the collapse of the fairy tale you secretly built in your mind. You thought love would protect you from comparison. You thought loyalty would erase her past. You thought your story together was somehow sacred, untouchable, safe. But safety does not exist. What exists is power. What exists is perception. And what exists, above all, is control or the lack of it. Machiavelli understood that when a prince loses control of perception, he loses everything. A ruler can be cruel, he can be merciless, he can even be hated, but if he appears weak, if he allows others to write the story of who he is, then his kingdom collapses. In your own life, this kingdom is not made of stone walls and banners. It is made of how you frame reality to yourself, and how you project that frame to others. The gut punch is the moment your frame is shattered. You imagined yourself the center of her devotion, and suddenly you discover you were one chapter in a book that had been written long before you arrived. That collapse threatens to turn you into a man who cannot look her in the eyes without seeing ghosts of her past. And here lies the critical danger. The collapse is not in what happened. The collapse is in your inability to master perception. So the thesis of this revelation is simple. The Machiavellian law that restores your power is this: do not fight reality. Redefine it. Do not cling to the fantasy that she was untouched, unmarked, unsullied. Instead, recognize the truth of human nature and impose a new narrative that places you once again at the center of control. The gut punch is not the end of your story as a man. It is the test that determines whether you will remain a child crying over innocence lost, or whether you will rise as a sovereign who wields reality itself like a weapon. The heart of this philosophy rests on validation. Not hers, yours. You believed her past diminished your present because you outsourced validation to her exclusivity, to her purity, to the idea that she had saved herself for you. Machiavelli would call this naivete fatal, because you staked your throne on something outside your control, and therefore you built your identity on sand. When the tide came in, it washed away everything you thought was solid. But the man who understands the Machiavellian law sees differently. He sees that power is not found in begging reality to conform to his fantasy. Power is found in bending his perception to conquer reality as it is. Ask yourself, what is more terrifying? The fact that she had a past, or the fact that you allowed that past to dictate the value of your present? The truth is, women have always had pasts. History is full of kings, emperors, and warriors who took wives who had lain with others before them. Yet those men did not collapse. They claimed their women as symbols of their reign, not as vessels of unspoiled purity. The gut punch you feel is not about her. It is about you. It is about whether you can reassert yourself as the axis around which her story now spins, or whether you will remain orbiting ghosts that no longer exist. But how does this ancient law manifest in the brutal theater of modern romance? The answer is more unsettling than you imagine. When you discover her past, the first impulse is always the same: rage, shame, a deep sense of humiliation that gnaws at your insides. You feel robbed of something you thought belonged to you alone. You feel like a fool for believing the story you told yourself about her. And so, most men react in the most predictable way. They confront, they interrogate, they demand answers with clenched fists and burning eyes. But what does this accomplish? Nothing but collapse. Because the moment you beg for explanations, the moment you try to make her justify her history, you reveal your dependence. You show that your power rests on her words, her validation, her ability to reassure you that your fears are unfounded. And she knows it. Women are creatures of perception. They read weakness like wolves scenting blood. When you break down under the weight of her past, you do not inspire sympathy. You inspire contempt. This is the common response. Obsession. A man loses himself in the theater of comparison. He starts replaying scenes of her with others, measuring himself against men he has never met, tortured by images that live only in his imagination. He becomes clingy, insecure, suffocating. He asks about details he does not truly want to know. He convinces himself that if only he understood the whole truth, if only she confessed every sin, he could somehow control it, manage it, neutralize it. But the opposite happens. The more he digs, the more he corrodes himself. The more he interrogates her, the more she loses respect. And the more he obsesses, the more he collapses into a man who has forfeited the one thing Machiavelli insisted was sacred: control of perception. The power response, however, is radically different. It begins not with confrontation, but with silence. Not a silence of weakness, but of calculation. Instead of reacting like a wounded child, you observe like a sovereign. You absorb the revelation, and then you ask yourself, what story do I choose to tell now? The Machiavellian law demands you reframe reality to your advantage. Her past does not strip you of power unless you accept the frame that it matters more than your present dominance. So you impose a new narrative, that her past was a wandering, and you are the anchor. That her past was chaos, and you are the order she has bent to. That her past was indulgence, and you are the man who demanded more than indulgence, who demanded devotion. This is not delusion. This is mastery. Because the truth of human nature is that perception defines value. If you act as though her past disqualifies her, she will sense the fracture in your authority. If you act as though her past was merely the prelude to your reign, she will bend her story to fit that frame. The perception shift is the true alchemy. What once felt like poison transforms into fuel. Instead of feeling diminished by what came before, you rise above it by claiming ownership of what exists now. You stop measuring yourself against ghosts. You stop begging for a history you cannot rewrite. You impose your reality so completely that her loyalty in the present outweighs every misstep of her past. And here's where the Machiavellian law proves its brilliance. It is not about the facts of her history. It is about the appearance of sovereignty. As long as you appear unshaken, as long as you radiate the certainty that you are the center of her life, she will believe it, and she will act in accordance with it. This is the brutal checkpoint. The truth revealed so far is this: her past does not destroy you. Your weakness in responding to it does. The man who obsesses over history becomes a slave to shadows. The man who reframes history becomes a sovereign of perception. But the stakes are about to get higher. Because if the gut punch was the test, the battlefield of modern romance is the war. And in this war, women are not passive. They are active players, testing, probing, watching how you respond. So the question becomes, when she sees your reaction to her past, will she recognize a man she must respect or a boy she can discard? In the modern arena, every revelation about her past is not just information, it is a test. She watches you, even as she speaks. She studies your eyes, your breathing, the tremor in your voice when you respond. She is measuring your strength, not in your words, but in your composure. This is the hidden dynamic most men never see. Women do not reveal their pasts by accident. Sometimes it slips out, yes, but more often it is a calculated disclosure. A probe, a knife slipped between your ribs to see if you bleed. If you crumble, if you lose yourself, if you turn bitter and accusatory, then she knows she has surpassed you in psychological dominance. And once that balance is broken, respect erodes like stone underwater. The common response of the uninitiated man is always the same. He turns the revelation into a courtroom. He becomes the prosecutor, dragging her onto the witness stand of his insecurity. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Did you love him? Was he better than me? Did you do this? Did you do that? He frames himself as the victim of her secrecy, when in truth, he is the victim of his own fragile illusions. Every question he asks is not a demand for truth. It is a plea for reassurance. And the more he begs, the less reassurance he ever receives. Because what woman can respect a man who builds his sense of worth on her willingness to erase her own history? He thinks he is fighting for clarity, but he is only proving his dependence. The power response is not interrogation, but reinterpretation. You never give her the satisfaction of seeing you destabilized. Instead, you take the revelation and you fold it seamlessly into your reality. You do not ask, "Why didn't you tell me?" You declare, "Now it makes sense why you needed a man like me." You do not stew in comparison to men long gone. You proclaim, "None of them could hold you, and that's why you're here." You strip the past of its sting by casting it as evidence of her need for your presence now. You turn what could have been a wound into a weapon. This is Machiavellian because it is not about truth. It is about perception. It is about establishing the narrative that you are the inevitable conclusion of her wandering, that her past, rather than diminishing you, only confirms the gravity of your sovereignty. The perception shift is transformative, not just for her, but for you. The instant you stop being haunted by her ghosts and start claiming them as proof of your throne, your energy changes. Your voice steadies, your eyes sharpen, your posture hardens. You move from the trembling need of the boy to the cold authority of the man. And she feels it. The same woman who might have toyed with your insecurity now bends under the weight of your unflinching certainty. She aligns herself with your frame because you have shown her that nothing, no shadow of her past, no echo of another man can shake you. And in that moment, she understands she is dealing with something rare, a man who cannot be dethroned by whispers. Here is the second brutal checkpoint. The gut punch was the first trial. Surviving it with composure was the first victory. But this reframing of her past into fuel for your dominance is the moment you seize command of the battlefield. The truth so far can be summed up in one line. The past only has power over you if you surrender your frame to it. But now comes the darkest question of all. What happens when she tests you not with ghosts of yesterday, but with temptations and provocations in the present? Will you still hold the throne when the threat is no longer a memory, but a living, breathing force clawing at your authority? This is where most men break, because the battlefield shifts from the shadows of her past to the brutal theater of her present temptations. A flirtatious glance at another man, a late-night text from someone she once knew, a sudden story about an old friend who reached out. These are not accidents. They are live weapons, subtle experiments, unconscious or deliberate, designed to reveal one thing. Are you sovereign or are you desperate? The weak man interprets every present temptation as a personal insult. He explodes with jealousy. He monitors her phone. He interrogates her every move. In his panic, he reveals the truth that he is not her ruler, but her jailer. He has no frame, only fear, and fear never commands respect. The common response is to fight fire with fire, to argue, to demand, to attempt to control through force. But the harder he squeezes, the faster respect slips through his fingers. Because a man who panics at every provocation is not sovereign. He is predictable. And predictability is the death of dominance. Women crave security, yes, but not the security of a cage. They crave the security of a man whose strength is so absolute that no external force can shake it. When you rage, when you plead, when you collapse into suspicion, you reveal yourself as fragile. And the truth about fragility is merciless. No woman can give herself fully to a man she must protect from his own demons. The power response in this theater is composure fused with cold assertion. You never deny that temptations exist. You never cower before the possibility of betrayal. Instead, you radiate the certainty that nothing, no ghost of the past, no whisper of the present, has the power to dethrone you. If she tests you with stories of other men, you do not beg for reassurance. You make it clear with your presence that those men are irrelevant, that her orbit is fixed around your gravity. If she flirts to provoke you, you do not collapse into jealousy. You let her see in your eyes the dangerous calm of a man who could walk away without hesitation, because his value does not depend on her faithfulness, it depends on his sovereignty. And that, paradoxically, is what commands her faithfulness more than any demand ever could. The perception shift that follows is staggering. When you no longer fear the test loses its power. She sees a man who is not clinging to her, but allowing her to choose again and again whether she remains within his kingdom. And women, by their nature, crave to be chosen by a man who could always walk away. The Machiavellian law thrives here because the sovereign never grovels for loyalty. He makes loyalty the only rational choice. He reframes temptation itself as proof of his dominance, because every time she returns, every time she surrenders to his frame, she confirms the truth he has already declared, that no other man holds her like he does. This is the third elevation. You have survived the gut punch of her past. You have reasserted your throne in the face of comparison. And now you have turned the present battlefield into an arena where every test only strengthens your dominance. But the question grows darker still. If power is perception and sovereignty is control of the frame, then what happens when you face not her past or her temptations, but your own deepest weakness, your craving for validation itself? Will you conquer not only her perception, but the inner war that defines whether you are truly a sovereign man? That inner war is the final crucible, because beneath every gut punch, beneath every test, beneath every revelation of her past or her provocations in the present, there lies one relentless truth, your hunger for validation. This is the secret parasite feeding on you, draining your strength, keeping you chained to illusions. You crave to be the only one. You crave to be irreplaceable. You crave to know that in all the men she has known, in all the choices she could have made, she chose you as the pinnacle, the summit, the unrivaled king. And yet, the brutal truth Machiavelli forces us to confront is this: no man is irreplaceable, if he believes his worth depends on being irreplaceable. The common response here is self-deception. Men drown themselves in fantasies, insisting their woman's love is proof of their superiority. They ignore the gnawing insecurity that whispers to them at night. They pretend they are sovereign, when in reality they are fragile tyrants clinging to approval. And when the mask cracks, when a revelation of her past or a test of her present exposes that fragility, they collapse, revealing they were never sovereign at all. They were only actors in a play, desperate for applause. The power response is something far more terrifying, because it requires death. Not the death of your body, but the death of your illusions. You must kill the boy who craves to be worshipped. You must kill the fantasy that you can ever be the only one, untouched by comparison, shielded from history. You must kill the lie that validation will ever come from her lips, her eyes, her loyalty. Because true sovereignty does not beg for validation. True sovereignty creates it. You do not ask her to crown you. You place the crown on your own head and dare the world to contest it. And here is the paradox. The moment you no longer need to be the only one is the moment you become the only one. Because the man who does not need validation is the man who radiates such gravity that validation is pulled toward him like iron to a magnet. The perception shift here is the deepest of all. When you stop clinging to her approval, you stop fearing her rejection. When you stop begging for her reassurance, you stop being haunted by her past. When you stop needing her loyalty to prove your worth, you inspire a loyalty stronger than any demand could enforce. You become what Machiavelli described in his coldest passages, a ruler who is both feared and respected, not because he controls with chains, but because he projects such unshakable sovereignty that betrayal feels like self-destruction. She does not stay because you cage her. She stays because your gravity makes every other option feel like falling into emptiness. This is the fourth elevation. You have turned the gut punch into a trial of sovereignty. You have transformed the battlefield of comparison and temptation into arenas of dominance. And now you have faced the enemy within the hunger for validation and conquered it by starving it to death. You have killed the boy and crowned the man. But one final question remains, darker and more dangerous than all the rest. Once you hold this crown, once you command this sovereignty, what will you do with it? Will you use it to rule wisely, or will you become the tyrant Machiavelli, warned against, the man who mistakes fear for respect, control for loyalty, and power for love? The crown sits heavy on your head, and now the silence of power surrounds you. For most men, this is the most dangerous moment. Not the climb, not the trials, not the gut punch, but the aftermath of victory. Because once you hold sovereignty, a temptation arises to wield it recklessly, to mistake control for wisdom, to confuse fear with loyalty, to believe that dominance alone is enough to sustain a kingdom. This is where Machiavelli's warning cuts deepest. A prince who rules by terror without balance breeds conspiracies. A sovereign who confuses his own security with cruelty eventually undermines himself. And a man who clings to power for the sake of ego alone slowly corrodes the very throne he fought so hard to claim. So what is the final edict? It is this: sovereignty must not be hoarded as a weapon of insecurity. It must be lived as an identity. You do not use your power to constantly remind her of her place. You do not suffocate her under the weight of suspicion. You do not wield your dominance as a whip to punish every shadow. Because that is not sovereignty. That is desperation disguised as strength. True sovereignty radiates silently. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need to demand constant recognition. It is felt in the way you move, in the way you decide, in the way you remain unshaken, even when storms rise. This is where love, paradoxically, becomes possible again. Not the naive love of the boy who needs to be worshipped, but the sovereign love of the man who cannot be dethroned. When you no longer need her to erase her past, when you no longer need her to perform loyalty like a stage act, when you no longer need her to validate every fragile corner of your ego, then, and only then, can you accept her freely. And in that acceptance, she feels something rare, something almost extinct in the modern world, the gravitational pull of a man who is utterly whole in himself. That pull commands her not with chains, but with choice. She chooses you not because you demand it, but because every alternative pales against the sovereign presence you embody. The gut punch was never about her history. It was never about the ghosts of other men. It was never even about her. It was about you. It was about whether you could face the collapse of illusion without collapsing yourself. Whether you could kill the boy who clings and crown the man who commands. Whether you could take the cruel lessons Machiavelli carved into history and apply them not to kingdoms of stone, but to the kingdom of your own soul. So now the choice stands before you. You can remain the victim of comparison, chained to shadows, forever haunted by what came before. Or you can rise as the sovereign, the man who reframes reality itself, who bends perception into loyalty, who rules not by begging for reassurance, but by radiating unshakable command. One path leads to resentment, bitterness, endless obsession with ghosts. The other path leads to sovereignty, to mastery, to the rarest form of respect a man can earn, the respect that comes from needing nothing, yet receiving everything. The law is simple. Do not fight reality. Redefine it. Do not beg for validation. Create it. Do not collapse at the gut punch. Use it as the anvil on which the boy dies and the man is forged. This is the Machiavellian law that restores your power. And now the question is yours alone. Will you wear the crown, or will you let it slip from your grasp, returning to the chaos of a man who never learned to rule himself? Because in the end, the only true throne is the one you build within.